Hey everyone, really excited to be here. I think one of the things that I was most excited about in coming and talking to you guys is the sort of variety of people that are here. You know, a lot of us come from design background, product background, whatever you may call it. A lot of us also come from a consumer background as well as enterprise. And what I'm happy to talk about is how these things kind of come together and the convergence of them, and specifically around my experience working in the enterprise, but figuring out ways that we can bring consumer patterns to the enterprise to make those experiences more engaging. So I hope that although most of my background is enterprise, I can share some concepts that can apply and kind of help in everyone's experience. So a little bit of background about me. I'm at Box, so I'm the head of our end user product. And what that means is I'm responsible for all of our end user apps. So this is our web experience, our mobile experience, desktop, and how they all come together into a cohesive way of doing work. Before that, I started my career as a designer. So started working at Salesforce, got into tech on accident, kind of started when people were doing web development as a thing. That turned into product design, and then over time, kind of working on. I think there were a couple key things that made me think about product. One was I was the only designer I knew that starting every project with a PowerPoint. I mean, with a spreadsheet. And so I was I really like the kind of organizational part of it as well as the design part of it. So if anyone wants to know kind of the good, bad, and the ugly of both, catch up with me after, and we'll talk about both sides. So right now I'm at Box. I promise that I will not make this presentation an ad for my company, but I do want to give you some context. So Box is a cloud content management company, and we work with about 100,000 different customers of all sizes to help manage their businesses. So a lot of Fortune 500 companies, about 70% of the Fortune 500 has some type of Box presence at their company, but we also have free product, so individuals can use it. We have small business products and going kind of all the way up and down that spectrum. So we have to think about the consumer user as well as the enterprise user. And what cloud content management means is basically we started about 10 years ago as a company that manages and stores content, and over time we found what's our differentiator. And our differentiator, one of the big ones was security, so becoming the most secure cloud content provider, and then over time thinking about how do we get more into collaboration to make this really interesting for end users. And finally, just thinking about enterprise software and giving the context on this industry, it's growing at a massive rate. So it's expected to be a $500 billion industry in the next 5 years, and this number has doubled since 2009. And one of the fun things or contentious things that I'll talk about is I found a definition that I thought was interesting, which is enterprise software is defined as software used to satisfy the needs of an organization rather than the needs of individual users. And I think that no longer applies. So let's talk about why things have changed and how the business model has changed and evolved. So back in the day, kind of early 2000s, there were companies like Oracle and SAP, and they pioneered enterprise software. And so they made these products that were massively adopted by a lot of different companies to manage their businesses. These were typically on-premise, so a sales team or a salesperson would sell to an IT buyer, and then that buyer would buy a certain amount of licenses, and then they were installed on-site. Sometimes they were actually sold as disks at the company, and then it was a one-time thing. So you would try to get the biggest deal possible, and then eventually you might go back to that company and try and sell a new product, but that took many years. And the products that weren't used, sometimes they would be called shelfware, if anyone's heard that term. So then in the mid-2000s, companies like Salesforce innovated on this, where they took a similar concept of solving these massive business problems, but took them into the cloud. And this changed a lot about how we had to think about end user experience, because you didn't just sell once, you had to actually go back and renew that deal. And so even though you were selling to maybe an IT buyer, it was important to get people to adopt the product. Now, there weren't always, there wasn't always evidence of this adoption. And so a lot of it was anecdotal, but still over time and as time has gone on, people started demanding things like usage dashboards to really understand how their product was being adopted. So it couldn't just sit on the shelf. But where we are today, this is what changes everything. With the emergence of products like Slack, the power has really shifted into the user's hands. So with Slack, this started as something where there were other chat products being used out there, and Slack came along, and people at companies started using Slack, and they put pressure on their IT organizations to buy different software. But at Box, we have a model where we actually will sell to an organization, and we depend on this land and expand concept for our business. So we'll sell in, and then we actually need people to share content, to virally expand on our licenses for a massive part of our revenue. And so this is really kind of the time of user's choice. And so the entire kind of industry is shifting in that direction. And this is something that I thought was really interesting. User engagement encompasses a lot more than design, but design-centric companies has been a topic that comes up a lot. A lot of VC firms have been doing some pretty interesting research here. And in 2016, NEA did a research study on design impact, and they looked at companies that had a design focus versus those that did not. And design-centric companies actually had a 44% higher retention rate, which is a massive amount. So these companies that just had design and user engagement, in thinking through it with their business, it made a really big difference. And those that had that were called a design unicorn, and the definition of design unicorn would be a company that has like a design co-founder, that increased to almost 88%. And so, for those who think like, oh, design is just about making a delightful product or like a pretty product, it has major business impacts as well. So I'd like to change how I think about the definition of, at least of enterprise software, is software that's used to satisfy the needs of an organization through its individual users. You need the individual users to actually get people to adopt the product, and to renew the product. So I want to talk about how we think about this at Box. We've created kind of our own growth funnel that encompasses sort of the different personas through the entire user journey and customer journey. So at the beginning, there's deployment. We have to make a product that finds product market fit. We have to make something that's interesting for companies to buy in the first place. But also part of deployment is how do you make sure that you deploy across different applications. So thinking about when you go and you're educating a new customer about your product, how do you make sure that they're getting the full life cycle? How do you make sure that their users aren't just using one part of the product, or they're not just using the web experience, they're using things like mobile or desktop, and kind of covering all the different edges. Next is getting people to sign in. So in this world, you can sell to a company, you can sell a bunch of licenses, but until the user signs in, it doesn't really mean much. And really the point of this funnel is making sure that there are no holes in this bucket. It's not a leaky bucket at any point. So there's no point in selling to a company. Yes, you've made that deal once, but you have to go back, and if people aren't signing in, then you won't get that, you won't retain that customer. Next is activation, and you could also think of this as retention. So our main metric here is D14 retention. So how we define that, this can be defined in a couple different ways, but how we define that is any user that comes in, logs into the product, is compelled to come back within the first 2 weeks. So they found something that's interesting. And if they don't do that, there's a much lower chance that they're actually going to become a long-term customer. Our next goal is weekly active usage. So once they've signed in, they found something that's interesting. In our case, somebody could maybe come back to look at a file 2 weeks later, but it's not really being embedded into their business process. Maybe they're working on a project with that covers a short period of time with a certain set of coworkers, and then that one can kind of end over a certain period of time. And so we need to find ways to make sure that they actually find value in using our product weekly. And then And then at the kind of end of this is daily usage. And so the reason that daily usage is important is that when you have a product that actually needs virality in order to expand into the company, in order to get more people using it, the only people that are going to do that are these weekly and daily users. So until somebody becomes an evangelist of your product, if anyone is familiar with NPS, Net Promoter Score, it's these daily users that are going to be your actual promoters, and they're going to be the ones that are getting others at their company and people at other companies to actually start using your product. So I will now go into some case studies, and what I want to walk through is a case study for each of these different areas of the funnel to talk about how we've kind of thought of the entire process of the customer journey from all the different personas. The first case study is about deployment. So one of the challenges that we faced is we have had a lot of success with our web product, but looking at mobile, we had fewer people interacting with our mobile product compared to web, and we wanted to figure out why. And so we started by doing a user journey analysis. So it's just a random user journey that I found, but basically the idea of the user journey is you kind of look from start to finish at what are kind of the different decision-making points for a user? What are the aha moments you look for? Where are they going to be happy? Where are they going to be confused? And doing research to user research to kind of figure all these things out. But the one thing that I want to kind of call out in the enterprise space is that one of the biggest flaws with a regular user journey is that we don't have just one user. We actually have our end users, we have admins, and then in some cases, companies will also have developers. And so each of these users is really, really important. So actually what we found through our user journey is we started at the very beginning of the journey. So in a typical user journey, you might look at what's the first time a user would be exposed to the product. But we took it a step further, and we talked to our customer success team, and we said, hey, what happens when you go into a new customer and you teach them how to use our product? When do you talk about mobile? Where is this? And so as part of this, we looked at the actual admin deployment part of our software. And to be honest with you, thinking about our end user product, this is not an area of the product that I go to frequently or that my teams are thinking about all the time. So we went here to our admin console, and what we actually found is this interesting setting. So we looked at our applications area of the product, and one of the settings is disable apps by default. So we thought, what is this? And as it turns out, we actually have an apps section that includes all of our developer third-party apps and our apps combined together. So 5 years ago, or some very long time ago, we had our native apps, we started building a platform, and we never thought to redesign this section. So what happened was this significant part of our user base or our admin base was turning off all of our native apps without even knowing that they were doing it. So looking at this screen, if you want to actually find Box for mobile, it was on page 15 of this as you're scrolling through the apps. You had to get page 15 to get there. So there's no way, and it turns out a very, very serious amount of customers had just turned off our mobile the ability for their end users to use our mobile product and our desktop products. So what we did is we redesigned this to kind of put them in a completely separate area of the experience. And so by default, our native apps were on. This is something, and we talked to a bunch of customers, and we said, did you do this on purpose? And it turns out that only about 20% of companies had actually turned off the native apps on purpose because maybe they just had a very specific use case. So now we turn them off. We have part of the experience that recommends against turning them off, and we didn't do that before. And so this kind of just really subtle messaging and saying, we recommend that you leave these on. That's another really important thing, is just thinking about not only kind of the placement in the UX, but also the copy, and then showing them a clear view of the portfolio of apps that are available to their users so they have the control. And this is something that we're just rolling out, but based on the size of based on the size of this population that had these turned off, as well as the size of the population of people who said that they purposely turned them off, we're expecting about a 60% increase in weekly active usage on mobile. So the second thing I want to talk about is the sign-in process. So one of the great things about our product is that we allow sharing without actually requiring people to have paid licenses. So this is great for when we have enterprise customers and they want to share something with a contractor. We want to reduce that friction for their partners and contractors. However, we had a very significantly low amount of them converting. So if we found out that actually the number of people that were using our product logged in was fewer than the people that were not anonymous users. And so that was just a really, really huge opportunity for us. So our existing design, our primary call to action was download. So if you see in the top right of the screen is a download button. And downloading is useful for people. It's what a lot of them want to do, and so we don't want to block them from doing that. And so we got actually a very high conversion in download, but only 2% of people ever logged in or signed in. So we did some different experiments, and one thing that's great, and I want to kind of point out, is we actually founded a growth team within the company about a year ago. And so while we are an enterprise company, and even I'm focused on end user, which is very consumer focused, we actually have a separate team that is strictly focused on doing growth experiments. So we have a couple PMs, a couple of engineers, and last quarter they did 13 experiments, and they actually doubled our organic growth. So tried a bunch of different variations with copy, with placement of the button. We did see an increase with just changing the action on the button to saving to box. But one of the tests that we did was letting the user download and then prompting them to sign in, and that had the highest conversion. So even though it was 1%, 2%, these are experiments that we did over a week. And if you think about the size of a company and what you can do as you continue to iterate on these type of experiments, it makes a really, really big difference. And so our takeaway here, what we learned was what worked best was not blocking the user from what they wanted to do. So they were actually able to download the file. But as they were downloading, we let them know that they were actually making progress. And then we gave them the call to action. The third part of our funnel is the activation. So by the nature of our business, a lot of our users don't have content the first time they log in. So if a company starts using our product, there's not just this pre-populated set of content. And unfortunately, a lot of users, fewer amount of users come back than we would like. They use it once and maybe only come back when another user shares with them. So we wanted to increase retention, and we thought of a couple of different ways of doing this, and we tried a couple different ways. So the first is sample content. And so we've tried a lot of experiments with putting our own content in there. So for example, defaulting to like a seed note where we give people instructions on how to use the product. Unfortunately, or I guess as another sort of part of the nature of our business, content is not something that we should determine what people want. This is in the company's hands, and it should be catered towards their use case. So no matter what, you're always kind of going to be wrong if you give people default content. The second kind of option for seeding content is company content. However, this takes a long time. So it works well for when new users come onto the platform from their company, but for initial usage, it's hard to get people. It requires a lot of work up front for that customer. So the best signifier of retention is actually getting the user to upload content on their first time. So we did some experiments to figure out what is the best way that we can encourage people to do this. So this was our experience for a long time, and kind of said there are no files in this folder. There wasn't a call to action. And we actually just recently did this experiment. So tried a couple of different variations, but actually I would say this is not the most like advanced visual design anyone's ever seen. We just did this as a basic experiment to a part of our population, and we just let people know, here's why you're here, here's what you can do, in some very simple simple copy with a call to action to upload. We did this in one sprint, and we saw an 11% increase in the amount of uploads that occurred with existing users. So moving on to weekly active users, this is where things I think get really important in kind of thinking about the long-term strategy of your product. We, as I mentioned, kind of the last 10 years of this content industry has been content repository. So there's companies like Box, Dropbox, there's like Microsoft products. People didn't necessarily know the difference. We really have been focused on taking the products from this desk to the drawer. So we don't want to be or from the drawer to the desk. We don't want to be the drawer where you stuff all your content. We want to actually maximize and create the most value that we can. And so we want to figure out what's the best opportunity for us to do this. So we looked at one of our product Box Notes. Box Notes was our first kind of content creation application. And it's one of our most beloved products. So when we talk to customers, they absolutely rave about it. But we had lower usage than we wanted. And so we wanted to figure out why this was. So we looked at a bunch of things. And this case study is really about, like, how do you go into a saturated market? Note-taking is nothing new. There are a lot of different products that kind of solve user problems. And so we looked at the different ways that we could approach this. So one thing that I think is really easy for enterprises to do, especially as they have an emerging product, is to copy their competitors. And so you may have a product that you start to build that's very simple, but then your customers will ask, they'll ask for something, or you'll see your competitor do that, and you chase it. But the fact is that the more that you do that, even though you think that it's the right idea in the short term, the more you do that, the harder it is for people to actually differentiate between the different products. So the second approach would be potentially, build exactly what your customers request. So we started with a very, very, very basic note-taking product with the kind of differentiator of collaboration, and then they wanted things like rich text editing. It's kind of making this a full-featured product, and we could have probably built a 3-year roadmap off of that. But what we actually end up doing is going back to basics and looking at users' motivation. And so we asked people, we did some surveys as well as some user research, and we asked people, what is it about Notes that you like so much? And what we found was that it was actually the connection with other people. And so rather than being kind of a place for you to draft your own work, it was where you could do team collaboration. You could hold your meeting agendas, and there wasn't anything as easy to kind of do for that. And so what we actually did is we took that kind of like psychology approach in thinking about how do we help to highlight the relationships between others, and how do we help to highlight the collaboration part and double down on the thing that was actually working for us. And so we did a big launch and redesign about 6 months ago, where we added some interesting things. So on the top right, you'll see this concept where you see the faces. There are a lot of other products that have this. Google Docs does a great job of it. But you see the faces, and you can see the history. And what this does is show people that once you've actually shared a piece of content, somebody's looking at it. So I shared something with my boss earlier this week, and he's traveling. We're both traveling. We didn't have time to meet on it. But then I actually went back to the document, and I saw that he looked at it. And so that was gratifying. Secondly, being able to see the changes that actually happen from other people. And so, I wouldn't say that this is kind of a concept that's never been done, but over here with the purple highlighted text, this just shows what other people have done, when they did it, and what changed about your content. And finally, being able to see what's changed on the left panel. This is what we call the inbox. And if you're collaborating with other people, the content that has been edited and modified by other people bubbles to the top. Of course, if you want to organize your own way by recency and things like that, you have that control. But with this model, you can actually see what people are interacting with at your company and what's changed there. And this actually resulted in something really significant. So this resulted in a 40% increase in weekly active usage of the product within a couple months. The final thing I want to talk about is daily active usage and thinking about how relevant content is. So users were having to leave Box to have conversation about their content. So they would basically upload a file, and then they would have to email it out to somebody else. They would have to send it via Slack. It was really cumbersome, but also made people want to leave, and that's the last thing that we want. We don't want people to leave. Secondly, people had a lot of difficulty finding what they wanted. And so I think the volume of data, just based on kind of the type of files that people are using, this is just in general, it's increasing by about 10x per year. And so one of the challenges is, it's just really hard to find the things that you want. And so we thought about some different navigation paradigms, because actually our number one piece of customer feedback is people are thinking about what they call content sprawl. So how do I see what I want? In the past, browsing was the main way of doing this. And so I would say that this is probably, this is what you do on your computer. You see a file and folder structure. This is a very well-known thing. But when you're working with a lot of different people, you have hundreds of projects. This can be a really manual thing. Another important way of working is search. And so search is very accurate, except you have to already know what you want. And finally, there's a consumption model. And I think that the consumption model was kind of something that's less used in the business world. And so this is very easy. This is like looking at things like a feed. But we have to be smart, and we have to guess what people want. And so in talking to users and looking at different personas, what we realize is none of these things are ever going away. People are always going to want to have a predictable way to look at their content, to search for the things they want, and to consume. And so, this is the home experience now. And so this is kind of that folder, this idea where we have a bunch of folders, and how do you walk through them? Similar, you can search, but it is kind of a manual process, and you really have to know what you want. And so what we did is we started investing in a graph. As I mentioned, there's this massive amount of data. And what happens is after you finish a project, it's just sitting there and then not really of value to anyone. And so we started investing in machine learning and taking this and kind of extracting insights from the things that you're working on. So we now know, who you work on based on who you share content with, what you're working on, and how recently that was updated. And we started building this concept called the graph. So our latest investment here was in kind of a model for consuming. And this is a product that we have in beta right now called the feed. The feed is really interesting, and I think the feed concepts don't necessarily work for all businesses. So I think a feed can work really, really well for companies that already have a lot of content. But one of the biggest challenges with something like a feed is actually creating the content. And so that's why people face a lot of challenges, and there's friction with just kind of regular social, because you have to maybe curate an image. You have to think about what you're going to what kind of caption you're going to put on it, and you have to think about that curation yourself. And so we wanted to make this something that users didn't have to do at all. So what we did is we took those couple of attributes and we brought the content front and center that we thought would be relevant to people. And what we actually saw is a massive increase in the amount of comments. And so comments is one of these things that actually gets people coming back and using the product. So comments is one of our main sharing mechanisms. And so this was really great because we actually served people things that we knew that they would want to interact with, and put the comment interface front and center. And we saw a really, really major increase there. We also saw a pretty interesting increase in recents. And so we've had this concept of recents previously, but this concept of recents is actually things that the person has recently clicked on from within the feed. And so this just kind of was a different, I guess, almost a way of A/B testing. Do they want to see things that have been recently updated by others, or do they want to see things that they recently clicked on themselves? And so that kind of is helping us with the way that we're going to design our experience for the future. But another really interesting thing is this also doubled our usage on mobile. And so I think I think for this example, just kind of focusing on making it really, really easy for somebody to interact with the product daily has made a big impact. So to kind of summarize everything, looking at the funnel, I think a couple things to think about in the enterprise space is, think about who the users are. Is it just the end user? Is it the admin? And what are all of their user journey? And so how do you get people deployed? Leveraging consumer growth experiments. I just mentioned a couple today, but the biggest breakthrough I think for us as a company is that looking at our organic usage and looking at the growth experiments, just doing these little things that that increase our usage by 1% or 2% here and there actually make a really, really big material difference. And so not everyone has the luxury of having a growth team. We're kind of big enough now that we can, but if there is a growth-minded product person, I was a little bit skeptical of the idea at first, but having somebody that's specifically thinking about these experiments and kind of working in partnership with teams, that was a really big breakthrough for us. In activation, figuring out what's the metric that matters, and for weekly active usage, providing feedback loops. So in that example, in the example with notes, we got down to the kind of base of the problem, what people really wanted out of our product, and made it different, and that was a feedback loop there. And finally, just reducing friction to make the user have to make fewer choices. And that's it. Thank you very much.